All right, we are continuing to read Primitive Mythology by Joseph Campbell. We're in Chapter 5, The Ritual of Death. Section 3, Persephone. The number of details shared by the Greek mythology of Demeter, Hecate, and Persephone with the Indonesian myths and rites of Satini, Rabia, and Hanuele is too great to have been the consequence of either chance or of what Sir James G. Frazer has plausibly called the effect of similar causes acting on the similar constitution of the human mind in different countries and under different skies. Like her child, the killed and eaten yet resurrected god of bread and wine, Dionysus, whose mythology we have already compared with the boys' rites of Central Australia, Persephone, who was known also as Kore, the maiden, was conceived of Zeus. Her mother was Demeter, the Cretan goddess of agriculture and the fruitful soil, and the maiden was playing, we are told, in a meadow, culling flowers with the daughters of Okeanos, god of the all-embracing sea, when she spied a glorious plant with 100 blossoms spreading its fragrance all about, which had been sent up expressly to seduce her by the goddess Earth, Gaia, at the behest of Hades, the lord of the underworld, so that when she hurried to pluck its flowers, the earth gaped, and a great god appeared in a chariot of gold, who carried her down into his abyss despite her cries. The god was Hades, lord of the underworld, and in the land of the dead she became his queen. Persephone's cries had been heard only by Demeter, her mother, and Hecate, a goddess of the moon. But when the mother bereaved sought to trace her daughter, she found that her footprints had been obliterated by those of a pig. For it had chanced most curiously that at the time of Persephone's abduction a herd of pigs had been rooting in the neighborhood, and the swineherd's name, Euvoluus, means the giver of good counsel, and was in earlier times an appellation of the god of the underworld himself. Furthermore, when the earth opened to receive Persephone, those pigs fell into the chasm too, and that, we are told, is why pigs play such a role in the rites of Demeter and Persephone. Originally, we may conjecture, Frazer comments in his discussion of this matter, the footprints of the pig were the footprints of Persephone and of Demeter herself. In a festival celebrated in memory of the sorrows and later joy of Demeter and Persephone, suckling pigs were offered in a manner suggestive not only of an earlier human sacrifice, but of one precisely of the gruesome kind that we have observed in Africa and among the Marindanin of Melanesia. The Greek festival, called Thesmophoria, was exclusively for women, and as Jane Harrison has demonstrated in her Prolegomena to the study of Greek religion, such women's rites in Greece were pre-Homeric, that is to say, survivals of the earlier so-called Pelasgian period, when the hieratic Bronze Age civilizations of Crete and Troy were in full flower, and the warrior gods, Zeus and Apollo, of the later patriarchal Greeks had not yet arrived to reduce the power of the great goddess. The women fasted for 9 days in memory of the 9 days of sorrow of Demeter as she wandered over the earth, holding a long staff-like torch in either hand. Demeter met the moon goddess Hecate, and together they proceeded to the sun god Phoebus, who had seen the maid abducted and could tell them where she was. After which Demeter, in wrath and grief, quit the world of the gods. As an old woman, heavily veiled, she sat for days by a well known as the Well of the Virgin. She served as nurse in a kingly household near Eleusis, which city then became the greatest sanctuary of her rites in Greece, And she cursed the earth to bear no fruit either for man or for the gods for a full year, until when Zeus and all the deities of Olympus had come to her in vain, one after another, begging her to relent, Zeus at last caused Persephone to be released. She had eaten, however, a seed of the pomegranate in the world below, and, as a consequence, would now have to spend 1/3 of each year with Hades. Embraced and accompanied by both her mother and the goddess Hecate, she returned to Olympus in glory, and, as though by magic, the fields were covered again with flowers and the life-giving grain. The seed-time festival of the Thesmophoria lasted 3 days, and the first day was named Kathodos, down-going, and Anados, upcoming. The second, Nestia, fasting, and the last, Kalagania, fair-born or fair birth. And it was during the first day that the suckling pigs were thrown, probably alive, into an underground chamber called a megara, where they were left to rot for a year, the bones from the year before being carried up to the earth again and placed upon an altar. Figures of serpents and human beings made of flour and wheat were also thrown into the chasm or chamber at this time. And they say, writes the ancient author to whom we owe our knowledge of this matter, that in and about the chasms are snakes which consume the most part of what is thrown in. Hence a rattling din is made when the women draw up the remains, and when they replace the remains by those well-known images, in order that the snakes which they hold to be the guardians of the sanctuaries may go away. The rites were secret, hence little has been told of them. However, in the widely celebrated and extremely influential mysteries of Eleusis, where the Kathodos and Anados of the maiden Persephone was again the central theme, pigs were again important offerings, and there, moreover, a new motif appeared. For the culminating episode in the holy pageant performed in the Hall of the Mystics at Eleusis, representing the sorrows of Demeter and the ultimate Anados, or return of the maiden, was the showing of an ear of grain, that great and marvelous mystery of perfect revelation, a cut stalk of grain, as the early Christian bishop Hippolytus described it, forgetting for the nonce, apparently, that the culminating revelation of his own holy mass was a lifted wafer of bread made of the same grain. What could have been the meaning of such a simple act as the lifting of a cut stalk of grain? What is the meaning of the elevated host of the Mass? As in the play logic or dream logic of any traditional religious pageant, the sacred object is to be identified, at least for the moment of the ceremony, with the god. The cut stalk is the returned Persephone, who was dead but now liveth in the grain itself. A bronze gong was struck at this moment. A young priestess, representing Kore herself, appeared, and the pageant terminated with a paean of joy. Between the primitive Indonesian cycle and this cherished, highly regarded classical mystery, through which the Greek initiate learned as a grave inscription lets us know that death was not an evil but a blessing, the range of accord includes not only a number of surprisingly minute details, but also every one of the major themes. In fact, at every turn, a fresh constellation of correspondences appears. At the heart of both mythologies, there is a trinity of goddesses, identified with the local food plants, the pig, the underworld, and the moon, whose rites ensure both a growth of the plants and the passage of the soul to the land of the dead. In both, the marriage of the maiden goddess or Dema is equivalent to her death, which is imaged as a descent into the earth and is followed after a time by her metamorphosis into food. In the primitive cycle, the yam; in the classical, the grain. The women of the Greek Thesmophoria, furthermore, placed figures of flour and wheat, representing snakes and human beings, in the Megara, together with the pigs being left until the flesh rotted, when their bones were brought up and revered as relics, while the figures of wheat were consumed by snakes. And a clatter of noise, rationalized as a ruse to drive away the serpents, accompanied the placement of the pigs and cakes underground. The ritual was related trait by trait to that of the youths and maidens murdered amid an uproar of drums, but has been revised to accord with a new attitude towards human sacrifice, that in the legend of the destruction of Cash was seen to have reached from Greece even to the Sudan by way of the long finger of the Nile. Fraser in The Golden Bough supplies many instances of substitutions of just this kind, and shows moreover that cakes in human form have been sacramentally consumed at planting and harvest festivals, wherever grain has been ground into flour and baked. So that in addition to the rest, it would now appear that the sacramental cannibalistic meal must have been at one time still another element common to the two cycles. But why, along with the little pigs and the cakes in human form, were there also cakes in the form of a serpent? Why not living serpents? Or why not pigs of flour? Greek mythology knew many stories of the maiden given to the serpent, or saved by a timely heroic appearance. For example, when Perseus, flying back on his winged sandals from his conquest of Medusa, was speeding through the air over Ethiopia, he spied below a lovely princess chained by her arms to a rough cliff beside the sea, and save that her hair gently stirred in the breeze, we read in Ovid's account of the event, and that warm tears were trickling down her cheeks, he would have thought her a marble statue. There came, however, a loud roar from the sea, a monstrous serpent loomed, breasting the waves, and the princess shrieked. But when the great beast, coming toward the maiden like a swift ship, was as far from the cliff as the space through which a Balearic sling can send its whizzing bullet, lo, like an eagle Perseus swooped down with his sword, and there ensued a prodigious tumult, the monster rearing, striking, plunging, and belching water mixed with purple blood, until the sword dealt finally the blow of the matador, and the serpent died. The name of this rescued princess was Andromeda, and her kingly father Cepheus governed Ethiopia, which, as we know from the legend of the destruction of Cash, was the kingdom eastward of Napata, not far from the seat of the rescue of the maiden Sali by the magic of the tongue of Farlimas, or from the villages of the present Shilluk of the Upper Nile, whose kings were ceremonially strangled and buried with living virgins at their sides. And when the flesh of the two bodies rotted, the bones were gathered into the hide of a bull. Could Persephone have been pictured in this manner, as offered to a serpent, so that the figures of wheat and flour might have represented such a version of her tale? Indeed she could, and indeed they might, for have we not already been told that she was playing in a meadow culling flowers with the daughters of Okeanos, god of the all-embracing sea? But Okeanos precisely is the great serpent, Ocean, biting its tail, who surrounds the world. He supports it also in the form of the waters of the abyss, and consequently is a counterpart of Hades, who, however, in the later anecdotal developments of Greek mythology, has acquired a separate character of his own. The serpent and human figures of wheat and flour not only may have been, but simply must have been, Hades and Persephone. And we must notice also that since Persephone was the great serpent's bride, she must have been able to assume the form of a serpent as well as that of a pig. Such metamorphoses are all part of the game for goddesses. We all know well enough the classical motif of the two serpents intertwined, which has become the symbol of the medical profession, the priesthood of the well-being that is the boon of the waters of the abyss, which waters flow as sap in the health-giving herbs and as the blood of life in our own healthy bodies. The figures of wheat and flour, therefore, represent the personages of the myth, and the sacrificed pigs, sacrificed instead of human beings, represent the participation of the living in the mystery, which, though it was one in the mythological age, in the lives and rites of men is many. Consequently, the victim is simultaneously one in many, one in its character as Dema, the mythological maiden, but many in the personal life offerings of each. The logical principle involved is that of the logic of dream and play, where, as we have already remarked, A is B and B is C. The Dema is the pig, and the pig is man, true God and true man. The legend of Henuele, too, contains an unmistakable hint of an earlier version, featuring the serpent and the painted snake on the cloth in which the little girl, frond of the cocoa palm, was wrapped when carried from the tree, and in which the coconut taken from the dead boar had earlier been left standing overnight. The incongruous device of the boar's leap into and drowning in the lake, followed by Amida's discovery of a coconut hooked to its tusk, as well as the unexplained mystery of the voice that spoke to Amida in his dream, letting him know what he was to do, suggest very strongly that some earlier form of the myth has been adjusted to a secondary reading, in which a sacrificed pig and not a supernatural snake should be preponderant, very much as in the mythology of Persephone and Demeter. The structure of the earlier formula is examined in the next section. We may say here only, in summary of the foregoing findings, that the Greek and Indonesian myths examined have revealed not only a shared body of ritualized motifs, but also signs of a shared past, and an earlier stratum of their common story, in which a snake and not a pig played the animal part. And the fact that, one way or another, the two cycles were not merely linked remotely by a long tenuous thread, but established on a broad common base, is made evident by a baffling series of further likenesses. For example, in both mythologies the number 3 and 9 were prominent. We know also that in the Greek rites of the goddess and of her dead and resurrected daughter Persephone, as well as of her dead and resurrected grandson Dionysus, the choral chant, the boom of the drum, and the hum of the bull roarer were used just as in the rites of the cannibals of Indonesia. We recognize the labyrinth theme in both traditions, associated with the underworld and rendered in the figure of a spiral. In Greece as well as Indonesia, choral dances were performed in this pattern. The reference in the Indonesian myth to Amida's desire to prepare a drink for himself from the blossoms of the cocoa palm suggests a relationship of wine or intoxication to the cult of the maiden plant-moon-animal complex that would correspond nicely with the formula in the archaic Mediterranean culture. And finally, is not the figure of Demeter, at the time of her departure in wrath from Olympus, bearing in each hand a long staff-like torch, comparable to Satene, standing at the labyrinthine gate, telling the people of the mythological age that she is about to leave them, and holding in each hand an arm of Henuele? There can be no doubt that the two mythologies are derived from a single base. The fact was recognized some time ago by the classical scholar Carl Kerenyi, and his argument has been supported since by Professor Jensen, the ethnologist chiefly responsible for the collection of the Indonesian material. Are we to think then of the early grain-growing stock-breeding villages of the Near East as adaptations to a temperate climate of a plant and animal economy derived in principle from the tropics? Or shall we say that the influence ran the other way, that the myths and rites of Indonesia represent transformations and regressions from a higher, less brutal system of thought originating in the Proto or Basal Neolithic villages of the Near East? The argument is not yet closed, nor is all the evidence in. For the present, we can note simply that a continuum has been established, with its earliest firmly dated marker in the Basal Neolithic stratum, circa 5500 to 4500 BC, in the Near East. A second field in the myths and rituals of the planting tribes of South and East Africa and the Sudan, a third, possibly, in Hadramaut, a fourth, certainly, in Malabar, and still another in Indonesia, and, as we have seen, Melanesia and Australia. We must now range even farther and measure the reach of this mythological zone into the Pacific, and even, perhaps, the New World beyond. So we'll stop there for now. Thank you for joining me. Next time, we'll read section 4 of chapter 5, entitled The Monster Eel. I hope you enjoyed this reading, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.